Here I am back for a second part of this video on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And then the last part I described the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, and I drew this nice messy diagram here, but basically explaining that aggregate demand is downward sloping just like a normal demand curve. But an aggregate supply curve, there are different ways people explain this. Some people have an aggregate supply curve that slopes upward, but then they have this brick wall that's a third curve they put in here that's potential GDP, basically. I'd rather put it all in just two curves here, where you have aggregate demand representing consumer investment, government, and business spending at different price levels, and aggregate supply representing the productive capacity of the country. And as we have seen, this all comes from empirical evidence and also a little bit of common sense, that you have three regions of an aggregate supply curve. One region is relatively flat, where you have high unemployment and lower GDP, and as you produce more, there's not much pressure for price to go up there. On the other end, there is a limit to how much we can produce, and if you try to stimulate demand up beyond that region, then you're going to hit a brick wall and you're not going to be able to do anymore. So let me delete some of this stuff here. So so that's this red section that is the vertical part, straight up and down. If you try to push the economy too far, too fast, then you will hit this brick wall and you will just succeed in raising prices, but you can't produce any more GDP. And then there's this intermediate region here where you can increase GDP some while also increasing prices some. And so this green region is kind of the region where we normally try to target the economy. We try to steer the economy so that we are a higher GDP than the blue region, but a lower GDP than the red region. And so we try to steer the boat in between these two dangerous rocky shores here. So in the middle, what we're saying is we're willing to take a little bit of increases in price as demand increases in this region, but there's a payoff. A little bit of inflation gives us a little bit of GDP payoff. But at some point, as you travel up this steeper and steeper curve, you get less and less increases in real GDP and more increases in inflation. And at some point, we don't want to keep going down that path. So let's talk about a few other specific points that can derail this sort of simplistic notion about what goes on. So let's look at a few details here, and let's look at some Keynesian perspectives as well. So one thing I want to talk about briefly here is the ideas that Keynes taught us. So before the Great Depression in the U.S. And also worldwide, that most people say started somewhere around 1929. After that Great Depression, Keynes was one of the big thinkers that tried to guide us and think about what's going on. And he introduced the following, a lot of ideas, but the three ideas I like to focus on are, number one, the circular flow of people spending, and then they give their money to businesses, businesses produce products, and then they pay their employees and other people, and the money just kind of keeps going around in a circle in the economy. We call that the circular flow. That can break down because of saving and investment behavior by consumers and businesses. And so what we're talking about here is something can make people panic sometimes. Businesses could panic, or people can panic, and if they think that Keynes sometimes used a term like animal spirits. Animal spirits is emotional behavior. People start to think that there's a problem, or they get cautious, and then what could happen is, in a normal functioning economy, normally we think about people save money. You save money, you put it in your bank account, and then banks lend that money out to businesses who invest it. And so usually there's this balance between saving and investment. But what if there's a problem in the economy where people they think that bad times are coming? They start saving more, preparing for the bad times, and businesses aren't going to borrow money and invest in bad times, right? If they think bad times are around the corner, businesses aren't going to borrow that money. So more and more savings builds up and sits idle, and it's not invested. The second idea, so this can derail the economy, because more people save, less is spent, businesses don't pick up that saving and invest it, the circular flow gets smaller and smaller. Second idea is of the multiplier effect. Now, there are a lot of multiplier effects that people talk about. The deposit multiplier, the tax multiplier, the government spending multiplier. They all work in kind of a similar sort of fashion. Any multiplier says when money drops into an economy somewhere, it tends to get multiplied. And so here I'm talking about, say, a government spending multiplier or a tax multiplier. They're kind of similar, but some people have a different perspective on the two. But let's just suppose the government gives me an extra $1,000 raise. They want to inject $1,000 into the economy, and they pick me, and they give me $1,000. The marginal propensity to save is the proportion of each dollar that people will save on average. So what will happen if I get $1,000? Let's suppose the marginal propensity to save for me and everybody else is about 10%. If I get $1,000, then I'm going to spend $900 and save $100 of it. So my propensity to save is 10%, is all we're saying. So I spend $900. Suppose I give it to somebody to paint my house. What's the house painter going to do? Well, he's going to save $90 and spend $110, giving that to someone else. Suppose he spends it on a tune-up for his car. The mechanic is going to save 10% and spend the rest. Suppose he spends it on a doctor bill. The doctor's going to save 10% and spend the rest. If this multiplying effect keeps going to its logical conclusion throughout the economy, then what effect is that original $1,000 going to have on the economy? Well, a simplified formula is to say 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over that 10%, equals 10. So if we add up the 1,000 plus the 900 plus the 810 plus the 729 plus, and we keep going to infinity, the limit of all these different exchanges is going to be 10 times 1,000, or $10,000. So that's an idea of a multiplier we need to think about. Why? Well, 2 reasons. Number 1 is when the government wants to make up for the economy being too small and they want to spend more money, well, we need to know how much money to spend, right? And what this multiplier tells us is that if the government wants to increase the GDP by 10,000, they don't have to actually increase government spending by 10,000. They can do it with something less, maybe 1,000 in this case, if this is accurate. Okay. The second reason is, let's think about this first idea. Let's go back to the first idea that I was talking about, this saving and investment behavior by consumers and businesses. What will happen to this multiplier in cases where people are upset? They think doom and gloom is going to come to the economy. Before the year 2000, a lot of people were talking about the Y2K effect, and that we're going to have a Great Depression or a huge recession around the year 2000 because all the computers in the world are going to go berserk because they don't know how to handle the year 2000 in their computer programming. This was a big deal. And what are you going to do as a consumer or a business if you think bad times are coming? Well, when you get money, you're not going to spend it. So what happens during the bad times is this marginal propensity to save gets bigger. Maybe it gets as high as MPS equals 0.5 perhaps, or maybe even higher. Maybe things get so bad that every dollar you get you save, or every additional dollar. So this doesn't mean that it wouldn't mean that every dollar you save, every dollar you have you save. This marginal means for each additional dollar you get, how much of it do you save? So it could be that each additional dollar you get, you save all of it. And so what that's going to mean is, as that marginal propensity to save gets bigger, 1 over the marginal propensity to save gets smaller, the multiplier gets smaller. If it's 0.5, 1 over 0.5 is only 2. That would mean that the government, if they spend $1,000, that's going to turn into $2,000 in additional spending in the economy, not the $10,000 we thought. So what this points out is it becomes harder for the government to increase the impact of spending during hard times, because generally the marginal propensity to save increases during hard times, and it makes the burden or the job of the government to try to fix an economy through spending even more difficult. The third idea is that Keynes added is that, look, classical economists thought that prices go up and down very easily in a market. Keynes said, no, prices are sticky. Prices go up fast, but then they get stuck. They don't go back down very fast. And this seems to make some sense here, that especially with wages, that people don't like for their wages to go down. So part of the old classical model before the Great Depression was, if people are unemployed, they'll just accept jobs for lower wages. And the average wage will go down, then more people will get hired, and that'll help fix the economy. Actually, we usually don't see people accept lower wages, at least not very quickly. Things have to get pretty hard, pretty bad for people to accept a lower wage. So as I say here, this is true. Prices will go down, but it usually happens way too slowly to avoid a big, long recession. So when GDP falls and people are out of work, what can we do? Keynes advocated that the government should just spend more to make up the difference. Replace consumer and investment spending with government spending. But again, with fiscal policy, they have two choices. They can either spend more, increase G, or they can cut taxes to businesses and individuals and let them spend more. So again, this works sometimes but not other times. Let's look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to try to tell us, let's look and see what might happen here. So let me erase some of this garbage from last time. Okay, so suppose we find ourselves with high unemployment at a place something like this, and people are very pessimistic. What should we do? Well, the government could spend more money, and that will increase aggregate demand. But, again, with the Lucas critique, as that we talked about last time, and so for two reasons, the marginal propensity to save will go up when the government spends more money. The Lucas critique, number one, says when the government spends more, especially when it spends more and it borrows the money to spend, people are just going to turn around and save more because they know they're going to have to pay this money back at some point. Some people believe this, some people don't. And secondly, because times are hard, people are going to save more. So just because times are hard and people are pessimistic, so pessimism, people are going to save more. So for both of these reasons, the marginal propensity to save is going to go up. The multiplier is going to go down. And that's going to mean that in order to get aggregate demand to go higher, the government might have to spend a whole lot of money. A whole lot of money to do that. Or cut taxes, a whole lot of money to do that. Now, what if your government already has too much debt? Well, this adds other problems. Maybe the government can't borrow anymore without losing their credit rating, or without increasing their interest rate on their existing debt. And so if you're already trapped in a debt spiral, maybe government spending is not the thing to do. And so this is why a lot of people say maybe we should let the Federal Reserve do it. One additional reason why fiscal policy is bad, or one thing that makes it, I won't say it's bad, but one thing that makes fiscal policy harder is it takes a lot more time to implement fiscal policy than monetary policy. Think about in the United States, in order for the government to spend more money or cut taxes, a bill has to be originate in the House of Representatives. It has to be passed. It has to go to the Senate, who has to pass it, but they always pass a different version. Then the Senate and the House have to get in conference and merge the two bills together. Then they have to vote again to pass it, and then the president has to sign it into law, and then it has to actually be implemented. And this can take a long time, years. So monetary policy, most people think, is a little bit better way to do it, where we get aggregate demand increased by the Federal Reserve creating new money by buying bonds. So they buy bonds. This increases the money supply. And when you increase the money supply, interest rates go down. So interest rates go down. And the interest rate that the Federal Reserve focuses most on is a short-term interest rate called the Fed funds rate. Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate is an overnight short-term rate that is between banks. So Wachovia Bank and Bank of America, if they loan each other money overnight for a short period of time, that's what we're calling that's called the Fed funds rate. It's not actually a loan from the Federal Reserve, which we call the Fed. So it's kind of a confusing name, Fed funds. And so if they buy bonds, there's more money in the economy. Banks have more money to lend. That pushes the interest rate down. When the interest rate goes down, more people are more likely to borrow more money. And when they borrow more money to buy houses and cars, or businesses borrow money to build a new factory, then the economy will get going. But wait, what about the elephant in the room? Didn't we just say that when times are bad, the marginal propensity to save will increase? So if we lower interest rates, when people are trying to save more, not borrow more, because they're pessimistic, and businesses are pessimistic, they don't want to build new factories in bad times. Sometimes what we see is that monetary policy doesn't really have a lot of effect. And this is one of the problems that Japan has been in for years. The Japanese government has been trying to stimulate aggregate demand in a lot of different ways, but they haven't been able to. And in the United States, this recession we're in now started sometime in 2008, and the Federal Reserve has had interest rates near zero for many, many years now. And our economic growth, 2%. Not fast enough to really get the aggregate demand back up to where we want it to be. All we're doing now with a growth rate of 2%. Here's a graphical depiction of what's going on in the United States right now, in my mind. We have relatively high unemployment, and with a growth rate of 2% in the economy, and unemployment rates going down very, very, very slowly, here's kind of what I see going on. Let me draw. I'll use green. I want to pick a different color that I haven't used. Let me use orange here. Here's what I see going on in the economy right now. We do have aggregate demand recovering as people start to get more jobs, and the government is still spending money like crazy, and the Federal Reserve is still keeping interest rates low, aggregate demand is increasing, but also aggregate supply is increasing. So I didn't go through what causes aggregate supply to increase, but let's talk about that now. Let's look at these factors. So the aggregate supply curve can actually shift if we think about these determinants. So what are the other things besides price level that can cause changes in GDP related to supply? A change in input prices could be affected by availability of resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. So if all of a sudden we allow more people into the country, say who have PhDs or have other sorts of resources, or if we allow more imports of steel and oil and other sorts of productive factors without tariffs, then this could shift aggregate supply. The price of imported resources, so we reduce tariffs, negotiate a free trade agreement, for example. If we bust up monopolies and make those businesses more competitive, that could shift aggregate supply. Also, anything that changes productivity. So productivity is just real output over the amount of inputs. Usually we think about how much output we get per hour of labor is a common way to do this for productivity. Real output per hour worked. So more machinery, more technology, more inventions, better technology, better trained workers can increase the aggregate supply curve because we're increasing potential GDP. Other things are the changes in the legal environment, which could be related to business taxes. If we make the tax system fairer, easier to use, we change the tax structure to give people more incentive to become entrepreneurs and open businesses, that can increase aggregate supply. We loosen government regulations appropriately to make it easier to start businesses. This is something we watch in various countries to see how many hours does it take to get a permit to open a new business in a country. In some countries, it's just 1 or 2 hours. In some countries, it can be years. Also, protection of property rights. The less protection of property rights you have means fewer businesses will be in the market. Instead of equals, maybe we should have implies there. Fewer businesses will be in the market and a lower aggregate supply. Why would I start a business if I'm in a country where the government can just take that business from me or shut me down for absolutely no reason? So protection of property rights, better protection of property rights can increase aggregate supply. So let's go back and look at our graph here. So what I see happening in the United States right now is even though aggregate demand is increasing, aggregate supply is increasing a little bit as well. And so, and we see a little bit of decrease in unemployment due to this, but not at the rate that we want. Not really at the rate that we want. So we are increasing aggregate demand a little bit here. Whoop, my computer is starting to go crazy here. I think I have drawn too many lines on it for the amount of memory it has. But in any case, let me wrap up the video now before we crash and go bye-bye here. But basically, in the United States, every year, in every country, aggregate supply and aggregate demand are both shifting. And so when aggregate supply is increasing, that increases the potential GDP. And if aggregate demand is not moving fast enough to catch up to it, then that means that we're not really making a lot of progress in catching up to that full level of GDP, even though we might have growth in the country. We might not see unemployment approaching that natural rate of unemployment yet. So I'll make a couple of other videos with other little details later, but this gives you most of the framework for aggregate demand and aggregate supply that you need in order to understand what's going on. And so if you have questions, as always, please let me know in the comment section below. But please don't comment on my bad handwriting. Thanks.